Thanks very much, Priya. So, welcome to me, and Happy New Year. And gosh, we're launched to the new year, eh? I can just feel how it is, how it must be for everybody to be back in this situation. So, I wish us collectively all the best for this tricky time to come, and hope that what we're going to do in this series on meditation will be of some use, will be of some solace for you, for us. Yes, and welcome Ben, who I think is here for the first time. I think has just appeared. Can't see him, but very warm welcome to you. So you haven't missed anything much. I've just started a little talk about the theme for the next few months. So we're going to spend effectively the next 4 months talking about and practicing meditation. So over the last period of restrictions, meditation has kind of been a bit sort of supplanted by other things. I mean, there has been meditation, but it's been quite short, generally speaking. So we thought, among other things, it would be a good thing to restore meditation, as it were, to a place of greater prominence, as we all know how important it is as a practice and as a skill. And the obvious thing to do seemed to be to take out and dust off and have a good look at the famous system of practice, system of meditation. So I prefer to think of it in terms of a system of practice, because it's not just meditation, of course. So when we talk about practice, we very often default to thinking in terms of our meditation practice. So we might say, oh, my practice is going well, or my practice isn't going particularly well, when as a matter of fact, everything we do in our Dharma lives is practice, or has the potential to be practice. But having said that, what we can do together in this format is really going to be largely about meditation, because that's the most practical thing we could do. So we can look at it in terms of an exploration of the system of practice applied to meditation. Now, I was thinking about the word system, and being a good Triratna Buddhist order member, I thought I should better follow the hallowed precedent and look up the word. And what I found was quite interesting. I found two principal meanings of the word system, which I think both have a kind of particular resonance to them. The first is a set of things working together as parts of a mechanism or an interconnecting network, a complex whole. Right? Whereas the second meaning is a set of principles or procedures according to which something is done, an organized scheme or method. I think those two things are quite different, that are both encapsulated under the idea of system. And I wonder, when we think about our system of practice, that we tend to incline very much to the second of those things. So we think about an organized scheme or method that we can follow, as it were, step by step, in line with a set of principles. So, and I think many of us probably think in that way, and it certainly has its virtue, to approach practice in a systematic way, so that you don't just kind of dot about haphazardly from one thing to another, and you've got something with which you can be guided. So guidance for your practice, as it were. But I do wonder, I think there are certain risks to that as well, which I'll probably talk about later. But the other definition of a set of things which work together to form an interconnected whole, a complex whole, I think is actually much more expressive of what meditation is all about. That you don't get different practices which are completely isolated from one another. They all hang together. They all contain elements of one another. They all kind of interpenetrate. And I think the beauty of that is that all of the things that we need to meditate, all of the tools that we need, we have in the practices that we have. So I think that it's quite a good way of looking at it, quite a useful way of looking at it. There we are. But for the purposes of just exposition, of just kind of going through it, I will look at it in terms of the former, in terms of the latter, the second set, the set of principles, the organized scheme. And then I'll talk about it a bit differently and and give some examples maybe. Yeah. So the system of practice that was kind of originated and handed down by our teacher, again, Akasharaj, sort of could be largely said to be divided into sort of two main parts. And for many of you, this is familiar ground, so I make no apologies, because it's always good to hear the same things time and time and time again. For some of you may be coming across this for the first time. But you could talk in terms of two kind of great stages, as it were, in terms of our meditation practice or our practice in general. And the first of these comes under the heading of shamatha, which I'd like to think of as being the happy, healthy human state. So there are practices that we can do which basically make us human, which make us positive and aware. Yeah. So that they give us the sort of all of the tools that we need to just lead largely happy, healthy human lives. And as a kind of essential prerequisite for doing anything else in Dharma practice. Yeah, so that's the shamatha side, which is sometimes referred to as the sort of concentration or the integration stage. Yeah, and that in itself is divided into two, which I'll come back to in a sec. And then the other stage is often referred to as vipassana, or insight, which some people you might think is where the serious work of the spiritual life gets done. So you've got to a particular state where you're quite clear, you're quite happy and stable, and then you can, as it were, start investigating more deeply, looking more deeply at things, at the reality of things, yeah, at the reality of your own experience. Yeah. So probing more deeply towards the truth of life and the universe. So the phase that we kind of tend to associate with insight and ultimately spiritual awakening. So those are the two kind of great stages in the system. And then there's just sitting or receptivity, which doesn't really quite fit in as a stage, but I think what receptivity tells us that it's really important just to sort of actually, well, be receptive when you're practicing. Yeah. To sort of, I'll come back to that and talk about that a little bit later. But with every element of practice, Bhante always said that when you do a meditation practice, it's always good to leave some time afterwards just to sit back, drop any conscious effort, and just absorb the fruits of what you've done and allow it to kind of work through you. And I think that it applies to the beginning of practices too, that you come into a practice from a state of openness and receptivity, and then you leave the practice back into that state. Because I know what it's like. Sometimes you just want to get on with the practice, so you sit yourself down and you start meditating without really having given yourself time to arrive and to kind of get to know yourself, as it were. So receptivity, the ability just to sort of sit back and allow things to filter through your being, is a really important part throughout the spiritual life. Yeah. So it's kind of the fifth element, if you like. But if we return to the shamatha side of things, so this happy, healthy human state, again, that's generally divided in our system into two subdivisions. So you have the phases of integration and you have the phases of positive emotion. Yeah. So integration's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I suppose one of the great kind of cherished illusions we have of ourselves is that we're kind of a person, a particular person who's kind of broadly stays the same, and it's broadly all, you know, we're broadly together, we're broadly moving in the same direction. And, you know, maybe that's kind of true for great swathes of life. You know, we think of ourselves as being a kind of unitary being. Yeah. So we identify with our bodies, and we identify with our minds, with our mental processes, our emotional processes. But I think if you look closer, that's actually a fairly dubious thing to do, because I don't know about you, but I experience myself as a collection of cells of different people. And sometimes they don't talk to each other, and sometimes they're in outright opposition to each other. And you may know this. I mean, we're at the time of New Year's resolutions. I don't know whether you've made any resolutions, but we can enter into the new year fired up with determination to do this or that, or stop doing this or that. And we might sustain that for a period. And then, you know, very often things start to kind of fray around the edges and we start to lose our resolution, or even overnight, we can suddenly hit a big wall of resistance and not want to do that thing at all anymore. So you might go to bed in the evening thinking, I'm going to get up and meditate because I know it's good for me. And then when the morning comes, a completely different part of you has taken over. The part of you that just thinks, I'd be much happier if I just stay in bed for an extra half hour. Yeah. Or the part of you that would rather sit at home and relax and watch a box set than come to Sangha. And often negotiation is involved between those two parts of ourselves. So it's a bit like we're like a bus, and there are different parts of us that take the wheel at different times, that end up taking us in different directions. So rather than steering a straight course sort of towards the citadel of enlightenment, we find ourselves kind of meandering around the landscape, going in this direction and that, depending on which part of us happens to be in the ascendancy at any given time. And very often those different parts of us don't really talk to each other. So you might wake up in a particular mood and your emotions are telling you something, and there's a particular story going on, and you might find yourself thinking that this is just how it is. This is life. It's a bit difficult. I'm a bit depressed, and it's just like this. But then something happens to change that. Maybe you have a meditation, and lo and behold, a different person emerges from that experience, and you take yourself by surprise, and you might feel a bit foolish for having bought into that other self and its message so fully. I still find if I get into a particular mood, like a slightly downbeat mood, that is just my life. Yeah, and that's just how it is, and it's real, and I have to kind of work with it and take it on board and believe what it's telling me. And then half an hour later, that state may have resolved itself, and then all of a sudden I'm somebody new, and I can go, fooled again. Yeah? So we have all these different sort of parts to ourselves that all want different things, that are loosely held together by our will, you could say. Yeah. So I think there's that level of that's what we might call sort of horizontal integration, where you've got all of these different cells stacked up alongside one another, and we kind of move between them, and they're kind of loosely bundled together, as it were. And then there's another aspect of integration, which you might call vertical, which is there are different layers of our being, and when you go down through them, there are parts of ourselves that we may not be very aware of at all. Certain sort of behaviors or patterns that might be quite old or quite young even, that might go back to quite to this early stage of our childhood, that sort of manifest under certain conditions that we don't know are there. Or there may be behaviors that we're simply oblivious to, that other people notice that we don't. Yeah, but it's often these sort of bits of that emerge, these bits of ourselves that we're not aware of from the murky depths, that can emerge slowly into the light over time. And I think that's an important process, because if there are really large parts of our kind of subconscious that don't want to do what we're doing, then we're going to have problems maintaining a consistent practice. And I think so. The stage of integration is about becoming aware that it is so, and then using different techniques, working on ourselves in different ways to actually help bring these cells together. So becoming more aware of all of these competing cells, and then gradually unifying behind the standard of one of them. Yeah, and bringing the other ones along with a sort of degree of understanding, and just being aware of so that they're all aware of each other. Yeah, and hopefully the one which is holding the standard is the self that wants to go for refuge, that wants to practice the Dharma, and the others kind of go along with it. Yeah, because we're aware of them and we give them a certain amount of due, and we might even give them a little bit of room to run around every now and again, but we're not in denial of the different parts of ourselves, the unintegrated aspects of ourselves. And then these parts of us that emerge from the depth, again, that's a mysterious process that occurs over time, and with the help of friends, I might come back to that. And so the meditation practice that Bhante says that works particularly well in this stage is the mindfulness of breathing. Sorry, because it's a way of cultivating clarity of mind, clarity of experience. isn't it? It's a way of becoming aware of the different parts of ourselves as they emerge into being, and seeing as they pass and are supplanted by other parts of our being. So it's a way of shining the light on this kind of shift from one part of ourselves to the other, of providing the bridge by which those different parts of ourselves can talk to one another. So rather than it just being a kind of simple concentration exercise, which is sort of how it was taught to me, I think of it much more in those terms. So you're just cultivating awareness and clarity on the sort of the scattered nature of your own being. And who hasn't sat down to meditate to sort of with dismay realize that they're absolutely all over the place? And when people start to learn to meditate, they kind of view the busyness of their mind and the lack of control they have over their thoughts as being in some way a problem or a defeat. And my response is always, no, quite the contrary. That is an essential step in the direction of full awareness of your own being, of clarity, of mindfulness. And the mindfulness of breathing is, at the very least, a practice where we become aware of how scattered we are. But over time, and with application and practice, it does become a deeper and richer and more fulfilling meditation, which we can more easily get behind. I've certainly found over time that I'm less subject to the kind of gross hindrances as I do the mindfulness breathing. Yes. And then you have the whole side of things, which is positive, which is to do with positive emotion. In a way, that's just sort of fairly obvious. Positive emotion doesn't need to be explained or justified. It's just a good thing in its own right. And clearly, that the practice, the principal practice which we teach, or the suite of practices, I suppose, which you could say that we teach, they're based on the metta bhavana. So the cultivation of loving kindness, of friendliness, and so forth. And indeed, all of the other so-called Brahma Viharas. So the positive emotions that arise when we encounter different sorts of situations. So you have the metta bhavana. You also have mudita that may arise when we rejoice in somebody else's good fortune, for instance, or karuna, or compassion, which is the response that can arise when we are ourselves in metta and are confronted with somebody else's suffering. So that's an expression of metta in particular circumstances. Or upeksha, perhaps the most difficult and elusive of those Brahma Viharas, which is a state of equanimity where we recognize the sufferings and joys of life and are not buffeted about so much by the worldly winds as we might otherwise be. So you add those two things together, that sort of clarity of mind, that ability to see the different parts of ourselves, coupled with a kind of healthy sense of positive emotion, so positive self-regard, positive emotion towards other beings, and you have a pretty good recipe for a movement towards the happy, healthy human state. So I think, for most of us, that is the kind of work in progress, I think, for many of us, for most of the time. Yeah. But then there is a whole different sort of stage or area of practice into which those practices, those states can lead us. And so I talked about the vipassana state, the vipassana element of this system of practice. And Bhante calls these spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. Now you hear the term spiritual death and you might kind of go, oh, it doesn't sound great, does it? I don't particularly relish the idea of dying. Yeah, so it sounds a little bit grim. But I think what we have to bear in mind is it's spiritual death. And in fact, what is actually dying? What is dying is the illusion that we hold on to of having a fixed, separate, and sort of immutable self. Yeah, that is what dies. And you can't even really say that the self dies. That's not an accurate description of what happens, because what we see through spiritual death is that it was never there in the first place. So rather than it being a thing that we have to a sort of part of ourselves that we have to let go of, or some sort of self, it's just a way of looking at things that we have to drop. Yeah? So we have to set aside. Yeah? So letting go of a faulty view of ourselves and of reality in favour of a less faulty view of ourselves and reality. And kind of the practice that there are various practices that again that we've been taught for this, one of which is known as the 6-element practice, which is basically a kind of fairly thorough but poetic analysis of the different constituent parts of our experience. So we look at all of them in turn and just kind of consider if there is anything fixed or anything ultimate or anything real or anything that we can truly call our own in any of those elements. So to do with the body and mental state and the mind and consciousness and even the space that we take up in the world. So this practice is a way for us to sort of look very closely at our experience and sort of break it down and see that there's nothing permanent, there's nothing fundamentally and irreducibly there in our experience that we can hold on to. So this is one example of a practice that is suggested and practiced by many people, particularly in the order for this stage, just to sort of enable us to let go of that illusion, that sense of separateness. And if we do let go, then what's left behind is a bit like the blue sky when the clouds part. You know, blue sky is quite a big thing in Buddhist meditation, particularly in the sort of tantric tradition. The sense of blue sky, free of defilements, free of passing clouds, open, vast, luminous, empty, and so forth. And I tend to think of spiritual rebirth in those terms. Spiritual rebirth isn't really a thing that we do. It's sort of the culmination of letting go. It's the culmination of letting go of wrong views, of letting go of habit, of letting go of hindrances and biases of all kinds. And what's left when all the negative states that accompany the view have gone is the blue sky. Is the blue sky that emerges from behind the dark clouds. Or if you like, the clear, pure water that you're left with when all of the kind of defilements are gone, from the famous similes that the Buddha uses in the Pali Canon to describe hindrances. Yeah? So the big picture part of this, of course, is awakening, is enlightenment, awakening to the true nature of reality. As I said, throughout all of these stages, we have to be receptive. Yeah? If we're not receptive, we're likely to end up, headbutting with an overexertion of the will, or just failing to recognize what it is that we should be doing, failing to intuit properly where we should be going with any particular practice, and not allowing ourselves to absorb what it is that we've been doing. And there's a lot more that you can say about it, but receptivity and just sitting, which is the non-practice practice that goes with it, is quite a big area. But when Bhante always talks about just sitting, he says, you just sit, and kind of leaves it at that. You just sit and you don't exercise any kind of will, you don't try and change the situation, you are just completely open and receptive to whatever's going on. And that is a powerful thing in its own right. So that's the system of practice. So integration, positive emotions, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, all of which are kind of, as it were, they move in a medium of receptivity. Put it that way, perhaps. So I explained it in a kind of linear way, but I think there are risks associated with looking at it in too linear a way, because then it looks like a kind of something you have to kind of slog through and tick boxes. There is a risk of thinking that, I've got to crack mindfulness first, perfect that before I move on to metta practice, and then talking about spiritual death and spiritual rebirth, that's just for the clouds. No way. And I think we've perpetuated that sense in Triratna a bit in the past, that Vipassana practices have been kind of held in reserve for order members. And in a way, I mean, I can understand why that was done, but I think mature people who are hungry for substance can be exposed to reality, and exposed to these practices in a way that works. Yeah, so that's just a little personal reflection. It was certainly the way when I was coming up that we weren't really, they were mysterious esoteric practices that were kind of kept out of the way until we joined the order, or were close to joining the order. And the idea of the problem with kind of linear progressions is that it's very tempting to want to be somewhere else other than where you are. If you see your path plotted out ahead of you with that kind of fabled mountain peak of enlightenment some distance away, it's easy to look at where you are on that path and wish you were somewhere further up it. Yeah, it's like the famous joke, isn't there, where somebody stops to ask an old guy on the road directions to get to a particular place, and he stops and thinks and said, well, if I was you, I wouldn't start from here. Yeah. So how often do we do that in our meditation practice? Sit down and wish that, and try not to start from where we are, but from some other place on this path that we would like to be. So I think that's one of the risks with this kind of sense of linear progression, of method, of system in that sense. But what I really do like is the idea of a system being a complex whole. Because I think you can more effectively and more usefully talk about the practices that we do and these elements of the system as a sort of mandala. So a mandala being an arrangement of elements or objects around a particular central thing. And those mandalas can change and shift as our priorities change and shift. So I think all of our practices potentially contain all of the elements of the path. And I'm hoping that that's what we will be able to draw out as we go through this course. Yeah, so that you're not left thinking that mindfulness is a separate entity completely from metta and insight and spiritual rebirth and all of that, because I really don't think it's the case. And I'm going to just give a few examples as to how I think that sort of works from my own experience. And I think it's important in doing that to sort of chunk things down from the big picture of spiritual death and spiritual rebirth being awakening, to see that we can have little kind of instances and incidents of spiritual death and spiritual rebirth in our daily practice. Yeah. So if you consider that spiritual death might be nothing other than the kind of the sort of releasing ourselves, liberating ourselves from a particular habit, from a particular negative samskara. Yeah. Or spiritual rebirth might be that aha moment when we actually see through something that we've been doing which is harmful to ourselves, and sometimes a negative habit will dissolve, or we'll be able to put something down and move a bit more into blue sky mode. So I think it's for my sense of these things, it's important to chunk these things down into the realm of our experience as it is now. Very often we have a very highly idealized presentation of the Dharma life, with lofty mountain peaks and sort of full of kind of ideals and shoulds and all of that. But it's really important just to come to where we are now, look at our practice now in our daily lives. So there are little deaths, there are little momentary breakthroughs, but little rebirths, if you like, little kind of movements in our being, and we don't have to worry about where they are on the road to the big picture all the time. So just a few. These are things that I've kind of got a little bit of experience of. I'm just going to try and express how this might work in our actual practice, just using examples of my own. So obviously, I mean, one thing is, if you may have had the experience when you sit down to do the mindfulness of breathing, and it's just a bit dry, a bit dull. It's a bit formulaic. There's nothing happening. You're kind of breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. It's all very familiar, and your mind just, I've got an opportunity to go off and start thinking. Yeah, because that may be a familiar thing for you. The practice is a bit desiccated. It's a bit lacking in colour, in emotional engagement. And on a retreat a number of us were on recently with Vasantra, and I've heard this before, and I think Tejananda does it too. The suggestion is that you just inject a bit of metta into your practice, a bit of emotional warmth, a bit of engagement into your mindfulness of breathing. It's allowed to do that. You don't have to keep them separate. And if you do that, if you because you're breathing in the same space, in the heart space, as it were, at least in my experience, and if you do that, you can suddenly open up a much sort of kinder, sort of richer, more textured experience of the breath. So breathing into the heart center as breathing with metta. Yeah, that was a really useful piece of advice. And doing that, it can sort of bring about a sudden moment of clarity. Oh, okay, I was in that state. I was in a bit of a stuck, habitual state, and now I'm not in that state anymore. So lo and behold, something's changed. At least for that moment, when metta kicks in and the mindfulness practice has been imbued with some form of life and color and interest, I can put down that negative state. And lo and behold, there's a little bit of blue sky opens up. Yeah. And we get a bit of perspective. We can see, oh, I don't have to sort of believe the state I started this practice in. I can apply tools to actually get into a different, freer and more expansive state. So there's a realization, there's a real insight into the kind of, if you like, the kind of the sort of malleability of personality, of the impermanence of self. So just a small example of how this can arise from the mindfulness of breathing. So you're breathing with metta, that enables you to sort of drop a particular pattern and see more clearly what you're doing and open up a little bit of blue sky. Yeah. And similarly, if you take the metta practice, so metta without kind of a little bit of an application of mindfulness can be it might be quite pleasant, but it's likely to be a bit soupy, a bit fuzzy, a bit kind of scattered and all over the place. Yeah. And in the worst sort of case scenario is that we can be trying to sort of cultivate metta without really having paid attention to how we are. And I have an example of this, which I'm sure I've talked about in the past. It was a very significant moment for me in the very early part of my meditation career, for want of a better word. You know how it is sometimes you sit down to do the metta bhavana and you go, may I be happy, may I be well, etc., etc. Nothing happens. And what happens is you start to get a bit cross. Yeah. The critical voice starts to arise, and that sense of yeah. And I remember getting to a point in the metta bhavana because it wasn't working. And I remember thinking to myself, right, I'm going to do the mindfulness of breathing instead. So I was quite harsh. And then at that point, there was a little light bulb moment and another voice, a little moment of awareness and clarity. And the voice came in and said, that's not very kind, is it? Not very kind. And it was a completely different register and tone of voice from the critical voice. So another part of my being intervened and met me in that moment. And what happened was that obstacle, it was like a big boulder on the road, just rolled out of the way. And I could go back to doing the metta practice. Yeah, so just a little bit more awareness, just tuning in more with how I was actually doing in my own being. So a little introduction of mindfulness into that practice, if you like. And that enabled me to relax and just to engage more fully with the practice. And when I do the metta these days, I try to sort of attend as fully as possible to the actual sense of the lived reality of the other people in the practice. They're not just ideas. They're not just thought experiments so that I have a certain experience. Because I think there's a risk of that with the metta bhavana, as we just think of these people and what we're actually interested in is how we feel. Yeah. So it's a bit like our attention goes to them and then it comes back, how am I feeling? Am I feeling kind of warm and gooey and fuzzy and lovey or not? Whereas actually it's not about us and how we feel in a certain sort of way, it's about them. And it's about cultivating an intention towards them, towards those other people. So I find applying clarity, applying awareness to those people. So where is such and such person? What are they doing now? I've got one friend who's a bit of a night owl, and I can be pretty confident when I practice in the morning that he's going to be asleep in bed. So it's quite easy just to, as it were, kind of send my awareness out to him. Yeah. And just sort of be with him in his being and empathize with his kind of basic concerns and his humanity and his joys and sorrows. But it requires a kind of effort of awareness in a certain sort of way. But an effort which is very, in some ways, delightfully effortless, or it can be if things are going well. That kind of natural ability to open up and empathize. And that leads to a sort of expansion of the heart. The heart center is, in my experience, the heart center is this kind of place in my being where my emotions happen. But when I'm meditating, it doesn't feel like it necessarily has to end with my body. Yeah, that feels like a construct. Actually, when I'm kind of feeling quite expansive and I've got a good contact with these other people and they feel alive and real to me, then it's as if my heart can just become boundless. It can become boundless. Yeah, in the sense that it doesn't end, it's not strictly defined by my physical experience. And so I think in that, there's an insight element in that. There's a letting go of a sense of being boundaried, if just in that moment. Yeah, there's a letting go of the kind of normal, the assumed boundaries that we have, that we end with our skin, so to speak, and everything else is in here. And I think it's a good imaginative way of actually sort of, pushing back our boundaries and making ourselves big. If you're going to have a self, you might as well make it an infinitely large one that you can welcome other beings into as well. So I think there's a kind of, in a sense, the spiritual death bit of that is just moving beyond and letting go of this sense of being limited and opening up into a kind of sense of being, of connection, of identification with the concerns of other beings as well as of ourselves. So opening up into a whole different way of relating. And I think there's a sort of blue sky element again. Yeah? That sense of expansiveness, that sense of newness, of opening up into new possibilities, a new sense of ourselves. Yeah. I'll just go and illustrate one more of these mandalas, I think, because time is pressing a little bit. So coming back to the breath, you can do the mindfulness of breathing as a kind of insight practice. I mean, one way that I hit upon was during Buddhist Action Month. And one of the things that I was practicing there was noticing the sort of how dependent I am, how on the breath. So when you're breathing, the breath isn't just, the air isn't just this stuff which is made for our pleasure and satisfaction and that we can take for granted. Yeah. What we breathe is manufactured by this sort of miraculous process of photosynthesis by billions and billions of organisms just growing and developing and creating this byproduct, which is what enables us to live. And that's an extraordinary thing. And if you want to sort of have evidence of your own contingent nature, your own dependency, all you have to do is stop breathing. And then you'll notice. Yeah? So if you stop breathing for a bit, and I can guarantee the next breath you take won't be boring. Right? So we'd all die without it. Yeah. So you're sitting there breathing, feeling your own kind of dependency on your connectedness with other processes and phenomena in the world. All of those plants who actually don't give two hoots about us, whether the fact that we can breathe what they produce is kind of, it's a happy coincidence, really. Yeah. And you can do the same with the other elements that you consist of if you want. You can look at the watery parts of yourself and think, where would I be without the watery bits? You'd be like the kind of the Tin Man in Wizard of Oz that, you know, it needs lubricating at the very least. Yeah. So we have to take in water, and we're constantly taking it in and giving it out. You're giving it out in the breath. You know, water is evaporating out through our breaths when we're doing. So when you're doing the mindfulness of breathing, all of these things can be there. Yeah. And with them, I think, a profound sense of appreciation or even gratitude. Yeah. Thank you to the air. Yeah, we shouldn't take it for granted. You know, we may not always have it. Yeah. It's so positive emotion, positive emotion. And again, through that experience of connectedness, opening up into the kind of web, the beautiful web of the natural world and our complete dependence on it. So all of this can arise out of the breath. Yeah. So again, you have all of the elements of the path in there potentially. So there's just a few illustrations of how I think our practices work and how all of the elements of the great system are contained or can be contained within them. Yeah. So yeah. So my hope is, at least for this series, that we will be able to, you know, illustrate some of that and make that a kind of, you know, a more tangible experience. Yeah. I mean, many of you experienced meditators this may well be old hat, and you may do all of these things, and you know, it's quite clear that the practices are a sort of mandala rather than a linear thing. But yeah, we keep coming back to them, and we open up the bits of the practice that need looking at. Maybe that's where receptivity comes in as well. You kind of know, you listen to yourself and know what it is that you should be doing. Like if you find yourself wanting to avoid a particular meditation, it's a pretty good indicator that you should probably do it. Yeah. So again, that sort of sense of receptivity to steer us in our choice of meditation practice. Yes. So I'm sure that's far from exhaustive, but I hope it gives just a sort of indication of the kind of complexity and the interconnectedness of the practices of the different parts of the system in the practices that we do. And we have all of them available to us. We have the breath available to us to explore and experience all of these things. And we have access to positive emotion. And we have all of the apparatus that the Buddha had. Yeah, I often marvel at that, sitting in meditation, thinking, well, the Buddha had senses, and he had a body, and he sat in meditation. I've got senses and a body, and I sit in meditation. So basically, I've got the same apparatus. It's not like he had sort of super senses or anything, but they're, you know, so our experience is kind of in certain fundamentals the same. Yeah, but we have all of the tools available to us in our meditation that can take us to awakening. But but also not getting fixated on that and seeing ourselves as just an inch along the path when it's all miles over there. Yeah. So opening ourselves up to the possibility to this array of practices as a mandala instead, that we can then explore and move between different and emphasize different parts of and move between different parts of. Okay. So I think that's probably pretty much what I wanted to say. So yeah, so we have an opportunity to go into breakout rooms, and I suppose in a way it's a bit like find out how we all are. Things are tricky right now. They may well be, some of us may well be experiencing things as being quite tricky. So in the group, just, you know, maybe take a bit of time just to find out how you're all doing. And then if you want to talk about your meditation practice and the extent to which you feel that you could combine different parts of the system. So how do metta and mindfulness work together for you? For instance, how do you bring spiritual death, spiritual rebirth into your practice universe? But it's up to you what you talk about, of course. So I would suggest, yeah, so the usual 20 minutes. And
we haven't got a lot of time left. What I'd like to do to finish off with tonight is is to go back to the beginnings, go back to basics, which is something I've been doing for the last 45 years. So I get so far with what you might call spiritual practice, and then I go in a full circle and go right back to the beginning of what I learned first of all. But of course, I'm not going right back to the beginning because I've learned so much on the journey so far. So what I'm going to do this evening is to start us off by doing a body scan. Now, we very often do body scans as a preparation practice before we go into what you might call the proper meditation. But I think the body scan is in fact a meditation in itself. We're actually becoming aware of the body. And if you think about it, that's all we've got. It's the only thing we really know is the body. So what I'd like to suggest is that in this week, that our meditation practice is in fact a body scan leading into mindfulness of breathing. Because I'm going to be leading next week's Sangha class, and I'll be looking at mindfulness and metta. And we'll be starting with looking at the body. So if you could get a bit of practice in this week by doing a body scan and perhaps linking that into mindfulness of breathing, that would be quite useful. What I'd like to do in the breakout rooms is to look at our experience of doing these practices. So I wouldn't like this next 4 months to be just about theory. I would like it to be firmly based in practice, meditation practice. So for the next, quarter of an hour, if we could just get ourselves set up for meditation. Just let ourselves settle physically. So that our body is comfortable, and we know we'll be comfortable to sit for 15 minutes. And bringing the attention to the head, aware of the skin, the bones, the flesh in the head. Just aware that they're there. Noticing the face, particularly the eyes, the muscles and skin around the mouth. And letting the awareness flow down into the neck. Down to the shoulders. Letting the shoulders soften. And that softening, moving down the arms, through the elbows and the forearms, the wrists, hands and fingers. Letting the arms and hands rest where they are. Bringing the attention back up to the shoulders. And then taking our attention, our awareness, down through the chest, diaphragm, the hips, not forgetting the back as well. Just being aware of the position of the body, how it feels to be sitting. Aware of the pressure as we sit, the pressure on the buttocks and the backs of the thighs. Taking awareness down the legs, through the knees, calves and shins, ankles and the feet. Aware of the pressure on the feet in contact with the floor. Broadening the awareness to the entire body. Aware of how the body feels as we sit. Aware of the areas of comfort and discomfort. And the parts of the body which are neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. And as we're aware of the body in total, become aware in particular of the fact that we're breathing. Watching the breath, feeling the breath as it enters and leaves the body. Keeping that general awareness of the body, and at the same time being aware of the breathing. Each time the mind wanders off, invite it back to awareness of the body and the breath. Coming to the end of the meditation. Bringing our awareness back out into the room we're in. Connecting to being with the Sangha on Zoom.